Okay, so welcome to July 28th meeting of the Zoning Subcommittee of the Planning Board. Copies of the agenda and all the paperwork is available on the side table here. The meeting is being recorded for later broadcast by Amherst Media.
Is your mic on?
It is. Steve, you're welcome to join us up here when you're ready. So the first item, are there any announcements? Okay. We're welcoming Steve Schreiber today. Hopefully he'll like it enough to volunteer at tonight's planning board to be say as a full member of the zoning subcommittee. But in the meantime, it's Bruce and I. I guess, Bruce, you made the minutes, and unless there's any further comment, I think we should just accept them by consensus. It's kind of silly to have a vote.
Sure.
So the minutes of the last two meetings are accepted by consensus. We're going to have a presentation by Ralph Karlstrom at quarter after. We're going to wait until then in case anyone thinks it's actually going to start at quarter after. In the meantime, we'll start on our business. So we have two main areas of discussion tonight. One is talking about how zoning amendment process should take place, both at the ZSC level and at the planning board level. And we're going to discuss that and possibly make a recommendation for the planning board discussion on the same topic later tonight. And we're also going to hopefully start looking at the possible zoning amendments for this fall's town meeting. We will not be making any recommendations tonight on those, I'm sure. So first of all, I guess I'll note that Planning Department staff prepared a summary of the history of the zoning subcommittee and some discussion of the alternatives that were discussed at the last planning board meeting in June. And as far as I'm concerned, they pretty much represent what I would respond. And so I don't really have anything further to add. Bruce? Do you have anything you want to say?
I did. I think if we continue to have the committee and hopefully with new members, Steve and possibly Connie, I think that would be fine. And I like Steve's idea of having more of the public comment at the planning board. But my only suggestion would be to do that as a first item of the agenda at the planning board, not after a public hearing. Because if people come here and are listening to our discussion and want to speak, to me it seems like asking them to wait too long if they have to wait till 8 o'clock or 8:30. If we could do that first, and then maybe public hearings would then typically start at 8 o'clock.
Or earlier.
Or even later.
Or
sure.
earlier.
Or earlier.
I think. I mean,
7.
we don't know that there's
7:45.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you have any comments?
Just because we've been talking on the board about possible restructuring, this seemed like a kind of a happy medium between what's been discussed at the planning board. Is that the zoning subcommittee be really kind of a working subcommittee that's obviously open to public, it's a public meeting, but the public discussion part of it would happen at the planning board. So I heard from the generally the planning board, that would seem like a good way to get more involved is by hearing public input. But so I think that the timing can all be worked out. Whereas I don't think it's the planning board meetings could start at 6:30. They could, and there's a lot of ways that we could accommodate that. But I agree that it should be seamless. So those folks who are interested in zoning issues wouldn't have to wait till 10 o'clock.
Okay, can I clarify what you're suggesting here? You're suggesting that perhaps the planning board can officially start at 6:30 and have a half an hour or whatever of public comment, and therefore zoning subcommittee meetings would end before 6:30 at 6 or 6:15 or something.
Yeah, so they're on the books right now to end at 6:30, so I know that they usually end at 7. But if the, generally conceived that if the timing were that the zoning subcommittee ended at 6:30, and I don't know about dinner, the dinner part of it, but then the 6:30 was immediately the report of the zoning subcommittee plus public comment. I think that would be one way to, to move ahead.
Yeah.
Chris?
I just wanted to offer the thought that the applications are fairly complex, and so you wouldn't want to begin discussion or hearings on applications too late.
Right.
So 7:30 seems like kind of the outside limit, so if
Yeah.
you were, disciplined and able to end the public discussion at that point and then move right into public hearings, it probably could work. But I think, working on conditions and going through site plan review criteria very late in the evening, is difficult. And if it gets past about 9:30 or 10 o'clock, it gets more difficult.
Bruce, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to agree with Steve. I like that idea of either having it seamless, or even if we have a 15-minute break or a half-hour break, to start first thing with public comment and the discussion of what we discussed earlier.
Connie, we're discussing the zoning amendment process. We're reacting to a document that the staff prepared. Have you seen it? Yep. Okay. Did you want to say anything
About that?
about any part of the zoning process?
Not right now.
Okay.
Settle in.
So I guess, do we want to make a recommendation or just allow the planning board to discuss it?
I think talk about what we discussed here and then get reactions to it. I know some people might think it's hard for them to start at 6:30. I don't know about job overlap and that kind of thing, so might need to talk about that. I guess another option would be for us to start this meeting at 5:30, perhaps, and go to 6:45 and then meet the planning board at 7, something like that. But maybe we can wait and get their reaction.
Mr. Tucker?
I think you would find that in many instances, particularly if we have public hearings that are going to be happening after the public comment, it's useful to have a time period to sort of allow people to set things up, for everyone to settle in. So while there's an attraction to having a seamless process, I think both for the planning board members' ability to stay awake all the way to the end of the meetings, a brief break to get something to eat and allow other setup if it's necessary that's a good idea, whatever timing you work out.
Vince, we have extended public comment or public presentation in a few minutes, and then we're going to have comment at the end. We don't really have time to do comment right now. I guess the second part that I wanted to discuss was a sense of the schedule for fall town meeting. How many meetings we have left, how many amendments we are considering, and whether, how much time there is involved both for the zoning subcommittee and the planning board to be working on zoning amendments. Do we have a count of?
You have a large count of potential amendments. A number of them occur as a logical thematic group having to do with residential rental uses. Then there are a number of others that you had identified as ones that the subcommittee was interested in bringing forward, some of which had originated in the village center work, but which were separable and could be considered distinctly. And there is at least one that we are working on that's a response to changes in state regulations. That's the DEP Zone 1 compliance, the protection of our surface water supplies. to make the zoning bylaw conform to what state law says. That's a fairly simple one. We're also, as you know, in the process of working on the transfer of development rights, and we'll be talking more about that this evening. Given the complexities of that, I'm not sure whether that would be ready for the fall or not, but that work will be ongoing regardless, because we're in the midst of a contract with the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission to do that. So while a number of the residential rental use amendments are fairly straightforward in intent, almost none of them are straightforward or simple in effect, and so there will need to be some discussion around those. The historic preservation amendments, similarly, although parts of that, extending the demolition delay period from 12 to 18 months is a structurally simple thing to do. There will doubtless be some community comment about that, and there are some other aspects of those amendments which we would need to consult with town council about, because we are seeking to create restrictions that don't currently exist, and I'm not aware that other communities have tried and enhance the community's ability to regulate or to preserve our historic resources. The sustainable alternative energy and LID requirements, the design and development standards piece, was lifted pretty much entire out of the form-based code amendments, and could be simply added to the bylaw with it's already been amended somewhat. That will doubtless engender some conversation, because it will be imposing new requirements on development of any kind. But it's something that has been vetted for almost a year. Similarly, the agricultural processing amendment grows out of the village center amendments that you were undertaking, and is aimed at village centers, and is also fairly well along. I will report that the FPC remapping rezoning process has essentially begun. It will occur in 2 phases. The first phase is an assessment of the accuracy of the existing federal flood mapping that we have, and the adequacy of the data, which can then be remapped as on more accurate base, as we have done with our GIS in a number of other ways. Once that process is done, probably sometime in September, we will better understand what we need to do for the second phase, how much groundwork, how much analysis in the field will need to be done in order to accurately map on the floodplain on the basis of the federal standards. We are in discussions with the contractor about how to account for climate change. That is not something that the federal government includes. They do not deal with that. And we want to have some way of projecting forward what flooding is likely to be, so that we don't create zoning we have to change every year and a half or in response to adjustments in climate. So we will be reporting more on that on an ongoing basis, but wanted to let you know that that's underway.
Okay. So I'm looking at the schedule here, and I noticed that a possible zoning public hearing is projected for the first meeting in September. That suggests to me that we will need to pick an article for that date soon.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay. So that's something that the planning board will need to make a decision on very soon, I think, on where it's going to go.
I would note, if I could, that town meeting is a couple of weeks later this year this fall than it would have been last year. So you have a little extra time, but don't get cocky. It's not, as usual, it's almost hardly time enough.
When is the warrant going to be signed? Do you know?
Oh, I don't have that with me.
Okay.
Do you have that scheduled?
I don't, I can go get it.
That's all right. It's for next time or something.
I just wanted to point out that backing up from the public hearing date, 2.5 weeks, we need to submit something to, for a legal ad, 2.5 weeks before, at least.
Okay,
So decisions need to be made probably sometime in mid-August.
okay. So by August 15th, we should, if we're going to have a hearing on the 5th, we need to have a decision.
There is a reason there's a question mark at the end of it.
All right, we're gonna take a break from our work right now and go to a presentation by Rob Karlstrom about housing issues, if you're ready.
See if I can make all this work. So thank you, Mr. Crowner. I want to say that I appreciate all the work by the neighbors and the schedulers to get this presentation in. I realize it is not a standard kind of way to present things, and so the opportunity to present this little presentation at the beginning, I know it took a bit of work, so thanks for that. And I'd like to extend an offer to those who weren't able to make it with this choice of a time slot. That, you know, it can be shared obviously, but I'd be happy to do it again or do it in another setting if that would be useful.
And it'll be recorded and broadcast on Amherst Media.
Right. Okay. So, so first of all, who I am, I'll just put up, if I can do this. So this is going to be a PowerPoint presentation. My name's Rolf Karlstrom. I live at 73 Fearing Street, Precinct 10, town meeting member. And I'm also a professor at the University of Massachusetts, so I'm the chair of the biology department. And so I moved to this neighborhood 12 years ago, in part to be able to, well, totally to be able to walk to work and to my research lab and have access to my work without commuting. So it's an ideal neighborhood for me, and I'm deeply committed to this neighborhood. And what this slide presentation represents is the last, over the last year or so, I've noticed some real changes and threats to the neighborhood, so I've started to document it a bit. And being a scientist, I hope you'll pardon me, I've taken kind of a data-based approach. And so what I want to do today is just show you what I've observed and some of the data I've collected over the last few months, year, and try to get at a little bit about why I think this is happening to our town. So that's what this presentation is. And what I hope to accomplish by the end is talk about 3 particular points and document these. One is this alarming acceleration of absentee landlord rentals, I'm calling them, non-owner-occupied rentals. And what that is causing in the neighborhood is a spread of, for lack of a better word, student slum. And I think it actually does apply in some cases here, that word. I think there are town actions that have actually put the neighborhood at greater risk. There are many town actions that have been helpful, including the hiring of a recent inspector and that kind of thing are very wonderful things. But there are several town actions that I think have put us at risk, and I'd like to talk a little about those. And just to document what many of us in this room know intimately, the consequences of these unsupervised student rentals for the neighbors. I assume everybody in Amherst knows this, but every time I present this, I learn that it's actually quite informative to kind of see the view from the trenches, if you will. So that's the goal. I just want to state right up front that I am very much centered on our neighborhood. This is all data gathered for my immediate surroundings. The things I present, I believe, are town-wide problems, but all of my information is just here. And so I want to define, kind of get us oriented. This is a Google map, Earth map of the neighborhood. In red is the area I'm going to talk about. UMass Amherst is up here at the top in yellow. Fearing Street is the street going across below that in the red zone. And more specifically, I'm going to focus right in on the Fearing Street neighborhood, that kind of purple shaded area where I've started to gather data about who owns what and what's going on in that neighborhood. So very neighborhood centric, but I think as this was a case study, I say, for the broader area, particularly downtown neighborhoods around UMass. So I call it the state of fearing. And just to remind everybody that this is in many, many ways an ideal neighborhood. It's a very desirable neighborhood, and I think it's at a risk of becoming a student ghetto. So some of the things that those of us who live there like to point out is, of course, the location. We can walk to town, we can walk to work. It's an ideal place for faculty, staff, town staff, et cetera, to live and be close to their work. avoid commuting and that kind of thing. We have a very strong community of neighbors. I'll show you that we're about 70%, depending on how you draw the line, owner-occupied, year-round residents. Families, mixed ages, classic New England neighborhood. It is quite old. We have residents still in place who are here in the 40s. It has a lot of history. It's been very sustainable. And I think, actually, I would make the key point that it is very important to have these year-round neighborhoods around downtown to actually sustain downtown. We are a big part of the group that just walks to town and uses the businesses and keeps them going. So I think it's very important that Amherst have these type of neighborhoods. And my observation is that Fearing Street is coming to represent a front line and whose future may determine whether bordering residential neighborhoods can indeed coexist with UMass, depending on how we deal with the problems that I'm going to talk about. So this is just one example of a map that I've made kind of to document the distribution of dwellings and how they're being used in the area. This map was prepared for a zoning board hearing. Some of you may have seen this in one form or another. Green represents owner-occupied dwellings, both single-family and duplex, multifamily owner-occupied. Red represents non-owner-occupied dwellings. So these are rentals that are with no supervision on site. And in this particular area, there are two fraternities as well at the base of Nutting. So this little map focuses on Fearing, a piece of Fearing, Lincoln, and McClure, and Nutting. And within that chunk, there's about 72% owner occupancy. Of course, as you go down Lincoln, that percentage will increase drastically. So this is just one example of the sort of distribution of uses. So from that little map, a few conclusions. In fact, this neighborhood is still very viable as a family type year-round community. But it's also reaching a tipping point. These non-owner occupied rentals, I'm going to argue, are pushing the neighborhood toward a less viable or non-viable situation. I think a few more unsupervised rentals in the neighborhood, I don't know the number, but it's not a lot more, are going to have a serious domino effect and cause residents who are living there to be driven out. And this particular ZBA decision was very critical. It was focused on 321 Lincoln, and the new owner had petitioned to have an owner occupancy clause removed from the special permit of that. And the ZBA decision seemed to very much acknowledge that owner occupancy is actually a key to the stability and sustainability of this neighborhood. So we very much appreciate that the message was heard on that one. And I want to continue that message a little bit here. Okay, so why does owner occupancy matter? This is the next set of data. I went and wanted to get an idea for where the problems in my neighborhood arise. I know there's a lot of different types of rentals, so I went and I chose representative rental properties, these are all rentals, that are either owner-occupied, so the landlord lives there, or non-owner occupied. And then I went to the police department records, and I've got them here. You can, some of you may have seen these, but for each property request, you get a sheet of police calls over the last 5 years. If there haven't been many, what you get is one sheet. If there's a lot of calls, it goes back 2 or 3 years, because that fills up the sheet. But if it's no calls, it's 5 years. Now, I didn't just present that as raw data. I wanted to parse out what was legitimate police calls, because there are many of those, and separate those from what I call nuisance calls. So just to get you oriented, sorry it's a complex little graph, but if you look in the third to the right, and if I wish I could point, is there a pointer? No.
There is, right behind your.
Ah, excellent. Okay, it's even green. Okay, so there's a large number of calls summed up, but I tried my best to be objective and separate what I would call a nuisance call, which would be everything from criminal activity to noise, liquor violations, and other nuisance calls, substance abuse, to services rendered, citizen assistance. I couldn't be sure of every call, but I tried to be conservative. And then I just entered the property and whether it was owner-occupied based on the property card from the town, and then sorted them by the number of nuisance calls. And the color coding here shows what the property card, every time there's non-owner occupancy, you're at the top of the chart, and every time you're owner occupied, you're at the bottom of the chart. I think this is very intuitive, especially for those of us who live there. If you have a landlord on the premises, it's a completely different property, and this is documenting that. I saw this very strange one here that didn't fit my rule. And as a scientist, whenever I see this exception, I want to figure out what's going on here. I went back to the property card. Turns out it's an inaccurate property card. I don't know how these things happen, but clearly this person does not live in the house from all the information I've gathered subsequently. So, in fact, that fits it. And I want to point this one out. And Linda has given me permission. She's a neighbor. She's here. She was actually the only owner-occupied rental. She has a duplex who had a few calls, just 2, in the nuisance category, and that was while she was away. So even in the best-run properties, when the landlord is gone, things start to happen a little bit. I didn't make those calls, by the way. Okay, so the conclusions from this slide, and I don't want to over-conclude this, but it's very clear that every problem rental property in my area is not owner-occupied, and every owner-occupied rental is not a problem. And no owner-occupied rental is a problem, is the way to say that on this slide. So, so there's 100% correlation. Not every non-owner occupied property will be a problem. Don't overinterpret it that way. But this is 100% correlation with where our problems come from in the neighborhood. It's non-owner occupied rentals. Okay. And this is just a tip of the iceberg kind of taste of what happens when you have unsupervised rentals in our area. And Phillips Street is the classic example of a student slum. And I can go out on a Friday, Saturday night and see sometimes thousands, many hundreds of people on Phillips doing all sorts of nice gestures. And this is the aftermath. This is what happens when there's not supervision on site. The point being there that type of noise and behavior is certainly not compatible with family, year-round resident occupation in the neighborhood. Okay, this is an interesting little correlation just on the upkeep of these properties. I made this map quite a while ago, back in 2010, for another reason. And soon after that, the town of Amherst had ACP visioning report from Johnny Longo's group. And they went through and tried to find properties that could be identified as blighted in the area to see if we could apply for redevelopment money. And just coincidentally, my red squares of non-owner occupied correspond 100%, 99% with the sites that were considered potentially blighted by an independent consultant. Okay? So my overall conclusion from this is that the primary problem for our neighborhood is not UMass, as is often said. It is not the UMass students, as is often said. But in fact, it's absentee landlords who are creating an environment that creates this kind of behavior, and they're contributing to the growing student slum right near my house. Okay, so why is this an urgent issue right now? Oh, I just wanted to point this out. Here's the opposite model. Linda Slakey's property here at 18 Nutting, Edwin Gensler's property here on 4143 Fearing are both well-managed, owner-occupied rentals. It provides a model where the students can live in our neighborhood. We can provide housing for students, and it's completely compatible with a family neighborhood. And so this type of student housing works. I would say the non-owner occupied model is much more challenging to make work, and blatantly, I would clearly state it has not worked in this area. Okay, so why am I concerned now that this is happening? Phillips is not a new thing, but in fact, over the last few years, there's an incredible increase in the number of conversions of family homes to rentals. And Mr. Tucker, at a meeting a few weeks ago, I just used your words here, pointed out that this was happening up to 1 a month. So I know the town is aware of this.
Yes.
And these conversions, what I'm calling conversions from a family to a rental property, what I mean by that is, 3 or 4 people in a family on average they're leaving, selling the house. An absentee landlord, an LLC of some sort, will buy it and either put 4 or 8 student rentals, usually student rentals, in that same house. So you go from 3 to potentially 8 people, and they're all their friends, which is often many more. So these were the purchases based on property card data. I just chose these 2 groups because they are near me. Sorry if I single these out. I know there are many other people, absentee landlord type LLCs, that are contributing 2 rentals around the town, but these are the 2 I was able to focus on in my limited time to look into this. So in 2007, the Chirrawahty LLC, Eagle Crest, or some of these other names also are associated with the Chirrawahty group as owners. They owned this or bought these in 2007. In 2008, these properties were sold. 2009, here are 3 more that come in. I'm sorry if I didn't orient you again. I'm a little different here. This is Fearing Street here, North Pleasant and Kendrick Park here, Amity Street, Main Street, and now we're going all the way down to Route 9 at the bottom of the map. So back to populations. 2010, another LLC bought a property in the area, actually over here. This is Mr. Tsang, who was the part of that 321 ZBA hearing. 2011, we have all these properties on Sunset, Phillips, throughout, and some are just off the map, and including now properties in many other places in town. It's not just an isolated problem, issue for our neighborhood. I haven't gone all the way around. Here's 2012 so far. So we've already got a huge number. Let me just illustrate. Since many of these are newly converted to rental, non-owner occupied rentals, there's not a long call history, but some of them have been have been the same kind of rental for some time. And these are the police calls that are associated with those particular properties that I documented. Okay, so just in the last year, we've had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, as you know, just as the ones I've been able to find so far in our area, and it's halfway through the year. So this is happening. I think it's an urgent townwide problem, and I think it has major consequences in terms of what I call the tipping point in our neighborhood. Now, for the next little bit, I want to talk about what I think some of the recent town actions have been that have contributed to this problem, because it is very much an accelerating problem, and trying to figure out why that's happening now. I think it's a perfect storm of both town actions and, of course, economic conditions with low interest rates and very high profits for these rentals that have allowed this to just accelerate to a scary point. So one thing that I think has made a difference is I think a well-intentioned town meeting bylaw for allowing by right conversion from single family to 2-family dwellings, combined with a family definition, which is always a challenging thing, but in this case is in our town 4 unrelated adults. That means you go from a town of a house of just a few people to 8 unrelated adults, and usually 8 students with their cars, with their friends, with that. So that bylaw with this definition of a family has been very problematic. There was an attempt at an owner occupancy bylaw to establish owner occupancy as the norm. I think that would have had a huge impact on this and made it more viable as a way to do what I think was intended to do, which is allow people to afford these big houses and rent them out to people on site. We have I'm actually very surprised for a town like Amherst to have no rental permitting system. We've talked about registrations, I think, in the past. There are towns all around this country at major universities have very sophisticated, well worked out permitting systems. That would make a big difference. They need to reward those who do things well and make sure that those who don't do things well aren't, I would say, preying on the neighborhoods where they're making money. And we don't have any kind of guidance on how to set expectations for students and student behavior when they come into our neighborhoods. I've asked many of the students who come in around me whether there's been any indication of they know where they are, that it's a family neighborhood, and almost to a one they say, oh no, this is just another part of the campus. We can do whatever we want. So all of those things together, the lack of progress and actual proactive things, I think have contributed to this conversion that's just accelerating and accelerating. It's going to continue to accelerate until we do something about it. Okay, so I'm now going to just do a little bit of wrapping up. I think there's 2 ways this could go. We could have a downtown neighborhood surrounding the university that looks like this. We already have a good chunk of it that looks like this. I'm going to call it a student ghetto. We continue to subdivide and rent out to at least 8 students. We have boarding houses, which have many more than that as well, which are of course worse than this. The year-round residents will not be able to tolerate that. I can attest to that. We will then lose this this contingent of town and downtown businesses, and the whole year-round aspect of the town will suffer. And of course, if we go, then there's just going to be a new front line, and it'll just progress down. If Lincoln Street, et cetera, et cetera. So it'll just be a spreading problem. I showed you what I think is a very viable alternative that we can get to with some actions, I think. We need to we stop these conversions to boarding houses and multiple rentals. We have to clean up the worst unsupervised rentals, bring them up to standard. We need to do, these are things we need to do to make this happen. We set expectations for behaviors and put that in the leases. We reward and allow owner-occupied rentals to thrive. This works. This can be one of the solutions to housing students in Amherst. We begin to replace some of the worst things and actually be proactive and try to get some of these houses into the hands of people who need them, town employees, UMass staff, faculty, who would be major contributors, year-round contributors. And then we become, I would hope to be someday, a model for sustainable neighborhoods surrounding a major university. So here are some immediate suggested town actions for the planning board, or planning board working with citizens, or town meeting, or whatever group is willing to do this. I'd say I would very much hope that we could think about a moratorium on these conversions. I don't know how to do that. I really am just new to this game and not a game, but new to the idea of how politics happens and how these kinds of things are controlled. But one thing, I think it's happening so quickly right now that a moratorium would be a very good idea that would give us a time to step back and think about how to solve it in other ways. Such as repealing this by right conversion, if that turns out to be the right thing to do. I'd like to have the town establish owner-occupied as a norm. This is a model that works. If we want to have a sustainable neighborhood, this is a model that works. I think a landlord permitting system is long, long overdue. And landlords can be responsible neighbors. I fully acknowledge that. Many of them are not at the moment, and that I think is undeniable. So neighborhood-friendly leases and a permitting system would help that situation. And then I'm going to, of course, give my thanks and acknowledge that the town has done a lot that is, I think, going to be very promising for the future, such as the new enforcement officer being hired. I think we need to follow that up with real penalties for violations. And that is, right now you can actually just fix things and move on, I think, to a large degree. I don't think people are really compelled to do it correctly at the moment. There's ways we can help the town do that, including online reporting systems the town could do that we could help then document the problems. And we should link ownership of these landlords. I think if one landlord has problems in one house, that same landlord is likely to have problems in other houses. And we should start thinking about looking at linking these things so we can actually get a bigger picture of where the problem's coming from. So this is my emotional appeal at the end, my last slide. We went around, took some pictures. This is what our neighborhood looks like to us. This is a beautiful place to live with many families and a dog that appears in many of the same pictures, many different pictures. That's my dog. And this is something that I think is going to be an interesting thing to discuss. I would contend that, in fact, we are the experts on our neighborhood. We don't have the expertise, a lot of the language expertise you have. But I can tell you, I know this neighborhood intimately. I know the trends. I know it house by house at this point, and I know where the problems are. I'm a very busy person, but this neighborhood means a lot to me. So I've put a lot of time into this, and so has everyone. Well, many people in this room I know. I don't know many of the others, but the people I know in this room have put in an immense amount of time to protect this neighborhood and think about ways to make it better. So as the final statement, I'd say that you have a citizen population here that's very knowledgeable about the neighborhood, has good creative ideas, and we're more than willing and are anxious to work with the planning board to craft and find creative actions that can allow for a viable downtown neighborhood to survive. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, questions from planning board members for Mr. Crosstrom?
Yeah, I'm happy to take questions.
I have a question about the slides you showed about the LLCs taking over properties. Those were properties that were purchased by the LLCs, or all the properties that are managed by those LLC.
Those were purchased by, a property card says the owner is the LLC. We've attached those LLCs to the particular owner of the LLC. They have many different names. So it took us a while to figure that out. But these are not the ones managed by Eagle Crest.
So there
This
are
is the-
additional ones that
yeah,
are also
Yeah,
managed.
and I should say, I don't know if Jamie Chirwati's in the audience, I apologize. I hadn't met him until yesterday, and we had a long discussion yesterday evening, and a very productive one, I think. And he said that about 25% of the Eagle Crest properties are owned by the Chirwati group under different LLC names. Right.
Okay.
Yes.
So just a couple of observations. I think it's fascinating. I think one of the things that happens that this group plus the Zoning Board of Appeals pays so much attention to abutters. So it's abutters and abutters of abutters that are notified of, these changes, that if the abutters happen to be non-owner occupied, then the likelihood of there being, this kind of participation, also diminishes. So I think that that's something to really pay attention to. The by right conversion, there's a by right. You mentioned by right conversion, and so I take that to mean from a single family to a duplex.
Right.
But that happens much less than the ones that are not by right, which are ones that go before the Zoning Board of Appeals. So the ones that go to the Planning Board are by right, and those really the institutional people that do that is mostly Amherst College for faculty. So
Yeah, I meant that more as another thing that makes the economic model for these LLCs much more attractive if they know that, if there's no special permit involved, and this is my understanding, that they have the right to simply just divide it and make 8 units out of a single family. If that's not correct?
We did have a very long involved process with the planning board on a conversion of a property at 79 Taylor Street. I think it was not this past winter, but the winter it was not this past winter, but the winter before. There was a conversion on Taylor Street, 79 Taylor Street, and it was very long and very involved. And I think that the planning board did as much scrutiny of that conversion as the Zoning Board of Appeals would have done. So I'm just pointing that out as an example. When something comes to the planning board, it's not necessarily, it's never, I should say, a rubber stamp.
Right.
It's, they always look at it carefully, and in that particular case, they looked, they scrutinized it, and Mr. Schreiber lives in the neighborhood, although he's not an abutter, and even after the fact, he was following it very closely and making sure that all the conditions were followed. So the fact that something is reviewed by the planning board doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to, sort of.
Oh, I certainly appreciate that. I think
Fall
that it's
apart.
just the bottom line assumption that the town and the planning board must take then. There has to be evidence for not doing it as opposed to evidence for doing it, if that's a fair interpretation. Not that it's not scrutinized, but the assumption is they have the right to do it in the bylaw.
So maybe my last comment would be that, I find the data to be, really interesting. So I was thinking about the nuisance call issue, that am I more likely to call for noise if I know the neighbors or don't know the neighbors? So the answer is if I don't know them, I'm much more likely to call the police than I am just to call the neighbor, him or herself. So I think that's part of the issue is simply, do you know the people that live in that house or do you not? And if
Well,
you
as a person who's done many of these, I strongly disagree. We know people nearby, and if there's a problem, we can call them first if we're able to. That's one of the problems with the non-owner occupied. We don't have that option first. So I would say there might be a little bit of a skew there. We can't. It's very hard to deal with anyone who's responsible. These things are very insulated. The LLC is ultimately responsible.
I'm just
The
speaking
owner
for
is very-
myself
yeah.
about who.
But I actually, so I have to get up at 1 a.m. and go find the address.
Yeah.
And I don't. And I write it down and I go back to my home and I call it in. So it really doesn't have to do with it. It's maybe the nature of my neighborhood, but when I go out there, I find what the address is and I always call them in. So.
I would just note that the planning board actually has been working on this for a long time, as have town staff. And we're well along, and some of the evidence of that is in the contents of this packet of amendments here. Last year, the annual town meeting 2011, the planning board brought forward an amendment to try and change, at least in the RG district, to change duplexes back to special permit when there was no owner-occupant present. The board has recognized this. And if you, again, if you look at these, you'll note that many of the changes that you are recommending, quite correctly, are contained in these amendments. There are, as we've said many times, there are aspects of this which we can't address through zoning, and that are being addressed through incremental changes to, we do have an existing rental registration system. To call it a rental permitting system, I agree, is a rather profound exaggeration. But we do have the beginnings of the bones of such a system, and we are looking at how to expand that, and we'll be adding things, including probably this fall, in the form of amendments to the general bylaws. There's more coming than just this, to try and fill in the gaps. Part of what, this is it's a very complex thing to address the principal concern here, which is the conversion of owner-occupied single-family residences to 2 or more units, because state law so ferociously protects the right to buy and sell property, to the right to recreate yourself as 3 different entities and do business out in the world. And if that happens to be real estate business, that's what it does. So we have to come at this from a bunch of different directions, and we are coming at it from all of those directions. We are just as alarmed as you are at the rate of conversion that we have been seeing. It is unprecedented in Amherst's history. We have had conversations in the past about sort of the percentage of home ownership versus rental. It is the case that Amherst, since 1950, if you look at the census data, has been 45% owned occupied units and 55% rented units consistently. It's gone up and down. The percentages have switched back and forth over the decades, but right now that's where we are again.
That's just the rentals.
That's just
not comparing to the distribution within the neighborhood of families versus
That's
rentals.
right. Yeah. What's different now is we had not seen previously this conversion of single-family residences. That is unprecedented. And we've been looking at this for 3 or 4 years, noticing the shifts and the changes in neighborhoods as a consequence. And one of the interesting things about this, that we have a Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods Task Force staff that are working on this. In our conversations with landlords, particularly the more established landlords in the community, they're worried about it because they go to sell a house to somebody and they drive down the street, and there's a student rental here and there's a student rental there, and the people in the car say, turn around, I don't want to buy a house in this neighborhood. So it's in the interest of the real estate community to make these changes as well. I think we are pretty close to creating or finding a community consensus on this from pretty much everybody who counts.
I found that presentation really interesting, and I was kind of talking to my colleague over there saying I think the full board needs to kind of see this. We have to distill it down in order to talk about it for the full board. In your kind of critique or analysis, there's a lot of things that I think we're coming to and would agree with. I think for me personally, the board hasn't really talked about this yet, although I hope we will soon, if not even later tonight, having a more robust rental registration system where those houses that you noted with the frequent calls, there would be penalties rather than just who's the owner, which is really what we have now. It's sort of rental registration light. So I think that's one thing we'll be talking about. I think best practices leases, we might be a little slow having gotten to this, but in our review of conversions, we do ask for the lease to be submitted, but up until recently, we didn't really know what we were looking for, and we're looking for certain clauses that allow the landlord to evict if certain town bylaws are violated. And so I think we're getting savvy about why we're asking for it and how to use that as a tool in the permitting. The part where I have a hard time is the owner-occupant change that you're suggesting. And you also gave examples of non-owner occupied rental property that was well managed. So for me, it's about good management and how to create good management. And it may correlate if the owner's there. Of course, they're going to keep a lid on things. There are also really well-managed properties where the owner isn't there. And from a land use perspective, I get stuck because I want to see duplexes allowed in a more liberal manner in general in the town, because I think it's good land use and it provides a variety of housing type and provides housing that's more cost accessible to people. And I believe our master plan refers to that as one of the goals, housing goals in the master plan. So if there's a way to stage some of these changes and maybe hold in abeyance that moratorium that you're talking about, that somehow appeals to my land use instincts. But I hear your point. I think to pass a moratorium is the same as changing the bylaw. So you need a 2/3 vote to have the moratorium on, you can correct me, on owner occupancy. You might as well take it away and put it back later if you want it. I mean, I think mechanically it's sort of the same thing. But that's the one where I get stuck, and not because of lack of sympathy or understanding of the problem you're describing. And if we can find ways to get close to the same result without having to go that far, that would work better for me.
Could I respond to the kind of the general idea there real quickly, or?
Sure, quickly, yeah.
First of all, I appreciate that this had been on the books and is being worked on by Mr. Tucker and others for a long time. What I observe is that, we have found best practices leases in the last week. There are towns that are doing this. There are very good examples out there that have passed all the legality tests that are stricter, much, much stricter than we are. This is not a major hurdle. We just have to find the one we like and plug it in. It could be 3 unrelated adults. That's legal in many, as a restriction in many places. The other observation is, if you do go to, so your observation that non-owner occupied rentals can be fine. I will grant you that. They are very rarely problem-free for the neighbors, if ever, in our neighborhood. I think if you want to go down that road, which I know is a major, it's a very compelling economic and for other reasons model, then I think that permitting system becomes absolutely crucial to link to that. It can't be a registration, maybe this, maybe that, and do whatever you want. It has to be, okay, here's what we want, and if you're going to do it, this is how it has to be done. I would take a very hard line and link those two things. And I would like to call it a permitting system, not a registration system, because then it becomes a privilege to rent, and you earn it, and you make money at it, and you are responsible neighbors. Yeah.
Mr. Tucker,
I was going to respond to the moratorium question. Moratoria are very hard to create. You have to have basically public health and safety basis for doing that, rather than general public welfare. We did it at the end of the 1980s on the basis of we were having so many applications for building permits that we were afraid it was going to outstrip the town's ability to provide water and sewer to everybody. That's sort of the kind of threshold that you're dealing with. I think, as Ms. Kruger said, that we can address many of those other questions very quickly this fall. And we look forward to working with you all on doing that.
I have a question. Is lack of, with regard to a special permit for a duplex, is lack of owner occupancy a sufficient reason for the ZBA to say no?
I would think not. There would need to be other criteria. I think if we make the changes that are being contemplated, and we haven't decided to make those changes, but if we use owner occupancy as a lever, then it would not be the absence of an owner occupant would be the special permit trigger, among other things. but even just if there was an owner occupant present, it would be a site plan review, at least, which is the current situation. I don't think that the simple absence of an owner occupant would be a sufficient grounds. You would need to have other reasons. One of the we were just dealing with the conversion of the fraternity on Nutting, and have been through a legal process on that. And there are a number of issues that have arisen around what constitutes sufficient evidence to make those kinds of judgments. So it's more complex than it seems on the surface of it. And we would need to work with town council to try and craft something that made sense in terms of where the threshold for evidence was in terms of a denial. That being said, a denial by a zoning board of appeals, unless it is outrageous, is generally supported by the courts. It's a local decision, and the courts defer to local boards as knowing their circumstances better than the court could.
Steve.
I think I'll pass. Thanks.
So I know a lot of people want to say something, but we have a lot of work to do. We do have public comment scheduled for later in the meeting, and hopefully we'll get to it. But we want to move into discussion of zoning amendments first. So hopefully our discussion will answer some of your questions. So let's start. Let's start looking at the residential use amendments and see what we have here. I guess one of the things that the planning board is going to have to do is decide which of these to pursue, if any, how many it's possible to pursue, and if there are any other zoning amendments that it also wants to pursue, such as transfer of development rights or village centers and the other things. So there's a lot, and we need to understand what we have first before we start getting into them. Can you provide a overview?
If I may, just starting with the 1 and 2 family dwellings. The first half of this, we're presenting this as a whole because it makes some sense to have them considered together. They are divisible on the floor of town meeting, and town meeting can divide it up into 2 things for purposes of consideration. The first thing that we're looking at is something we had a conversation with town council about earlier this spring, the possibility of creating more than one class of single-family dwelling for purposes of regulation. That a single-family residence that is being rented under specific circumstances may be considered a commercial activity. It's a residential use, but it's being operated as a commercial activity, and on that basis regulated differently. For the purposes of thinking about this, we have tried to be expansive about what would be included under the absolutely by right, the yes, single-family residence, which would include not only owner-occupied, family-occupied, household-occupied situation, but a household that is rented and consisted of an individual, a group of 2 or more people who are related, a group of not more than 2 unrelated people, as again is provided for elsewhere in the bylaw, or a functional family, which is one of the amendments that we are looking at creating, where you have a household unit that is operating in all recognizable ways as a family. Everybody owns everything. There are kids going to school. Everybody works locally. There are a number of criteria that we'll get to when we get there. And the notion that we would need to have a special permit for the rental of a house to a range of folks here did not seem to make sense. So we're trying to create, this may be getting into too great a detail, but we're trying to create a range of possibility for a rental of a single family where you don't have to have a special permit for it. Class 2 is specifically for a household of 3 to 4 unrelated persons where no owner resides on the property. And the household does not correspond to any of the characteristics described under the Class 1. We reiterate in the language here that not more than 4 unrelated, which is our current limit, except as provided for under functional family. Further, a single family that is a Class 2 single family would not be eligible to have a number of the accessory uses, lodgers or boarders, be operated as bed and breakfast, and so forth. And we allow that the special permit granting authority may require the presence of an on-site resident manager as a condition of approval. As we go forward, the notion of what an on-site resident manager is needs to be examined fairly closely, because just saying, oh, I'm one of the 4 people who live here, I'm going to school, I'm the person you call if there's a problem, therefore I'm the manager, may not be sufficient, and we might not want it to be sufficient. So that's the first part. We are going to need to check this with town council, and we will do so fairly quickly so that we have the legal review under our belt before we go much further with it. The second half here is about duplexes, and we are doing the same thing. We are creating 2 classes of duplexes, one of which, Class 1, involves the presence of an owner-occupant in one or more of the units, and the other of which does not. And that's the basic difference. And we are also adding some definitions. We are trying to clean up the definitions of duplex. We are adding a definition for an on-site resident manager. We've had some conversations with our new building commissioner about this. We have added a definition for principal residence. So we're trying to create the fences that steer everybody in the direction we want them to go here. And I'm not going to go into greater detail than that, but
That's
this
fine.
is just sort of an introductory review. The second one, and I'll try to go through these quickly here, converted dwelling. There had for some time been a question, under a converted dwelling use, you could have 2 units. Is that a converted dwelling or is that a duplex? Previously, there had not been a clear definition of what conversion meant. What we're trying to do is firm that up, that we're really, in fact, talking about the conversion of existing structures. We're not talking about new construction, except in perhaps as some small portion of an addition. You're talking about the conversion of existing structures that in circumstances where duplexes are not permitted, and there are some, where you have, for instance, in the neighborhood business district, where you want to encourage denser residential uses, you don't want the creation of a new duplex, a new 2-family, because it's not a dense enough use. But if you have an existing single-family residence there that's non-conforming, and it doesn't have room to do anything more than create 1 more additional unit, then it makes sense to allow for the densification of the uses on the site through that mechanism. One of the things that's being added to all of these, the one I mentioned before and this one, is a requirement that all residential units created under these regulations be registered under the Board of Health's rental registration system. What that does is set us up in a situation where we have as many of the rental units in Amherst as possible in the rental registration system, so that we can then go through the process of creating additional useful regulation for that. There are a number of other changes here, including an improvement, we think, to the converted dwelling definition. Basically, we're talking about not less than 80% of what's being created as new residential square footage being the conversion of existing structure, and then up to 20%, but not more, being new construction if necessary.
Can I
yeah.
interrupt for just a minute? So I think the question of is it a duplex or is it a conversion is you know, I looked at this and I'm still not sure I understand when you're applying one, when you're applying the other. So for instance, the house on Sunset, that was
That would have come in under converted dwelling, under this
okay.
amendment.
The house on the house on Sunset that we heard and then went to zoning board of
Yes,
appeals?
right.
Okay.
So it came as a duplex application, but you're saying it should have, or in the future, it would, if this passes, come as a converted.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Lodging or boarding house. There's some confusion about this. This is a distinct, different use category where a residential structure or a portion of a residential structure is being used specifically for the purpose of lodging or boarding. Rooms are being rented out to, rooms or suites are being rented out to individuals for fairly extended periods of time, not overnight. This is not the same as an accessory lodging or boarding room where you're letting a room for a night because someone's coming in to, over the weekend to do something at the university. Or it's not the same as operating a bed and breakfast out of your home, because the home is the principal use and those are the accessory uses. This is where the principal use of the property is as a lodging or boarding house. And one of the things that we suspect may happen, Mr. Carlstrom in his presentation referred to existing lodging or boarding houses. Well, I'm not at all convinced that there are any properties in the areas he referred to that are currently being regulated as lodging or boarding houses, even though they're functioning that way. And part of what will happen is if there's a complaint, a zoning complaint or something else, we find out what's going on, the property is then required to apply for a permit for a lodging or boarding house and comes under the regulation for that use. Yeah, this is a use that's been long recognized in state law, so there's a lot of precedent for what this use consists of. What we're doing is adding definitions and standards and conditions which reflect that. In a way, again, we're trying to sort of create this tapestry of regulation that covers all of the residential rental possibilities in a comprehensive and sensible way. That doesn't mean that what we've started out with has that effect yet, but that's the intent. We've included in this something that was under the village center zoning, a live-work use. And what we have done is expand the existing mixed-use building use category, a building containing dwelling units in combination with stores or et cetera. Because a live-work use is essentially that same thing, where you have a residential use and a business use occupying a single property. And the proprietor or the owner or the manager or the operator of the business is residing there. So it's really two different intensities of the same kind of use. We have a number of times, part of the reason we're bringing this forward, and this is sort of a staff initiative, you didn't request this, so we have a number of times had requests involving properties that are currently vacant, for instance, in the Village Center Business District around the Amherst Depot, that were formerly single-family homes. And they are scaled in such a way that it would be perfectly appropriate for a business to operate on the first floor and the business proprietor to live upstairs. But we didn't have a use category into which to put that. We were having to take a crowbar to the use categories we were and sort of contort them. And so part of the intent here is to add this so that we've got that covered. And it also allows for the possibility that employees might also live there. So we have that seemed to fit under the general residential category here. The functional family definition, this has actually been in the works for a long time, since I believe 2010, when we had a petition article to try and do away with the foreign related provision in our family definition. And the response at the time, those of you who were on the subcommittee at the time you might recall, was to say not to remove the foreign related, but to try and address circumstances where the bylaw does not currently cover households that are essentially functioning like families, and our regulations as they stand are discriminating because they don't speak to those people's lives. So what this does is try and describe, and this is language that has been borrowed from other communities that have been doing this for some time, the characteristics for a household functioning as a family. and allow people to apply to occupy a residential unit under that category. Finally, in the complex of residential amendments, all of those which were involving the creation of rental units, I noted earlier, we are adding a requirement that they register with the rental registration system. We are not amending all of the residential uses that involve the creation of rental units. So what we're doing is adding an amendment that would, for all of the rest of those categories, townhouses, apartments, subdividable dwellings, and in certain circumstances, supplemental apartments, where you're creating a rental unit, you would have to register it under the system as it stands. So that is the general packet of residential uses.
Okay, thanks. Any questions from the members of the committee? Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I don't really have a question, so I'll wait if we're going to have comment or just, I guess it was a process kind of thing. This is comprehensive tapestry, was Jonathan's words, and my first blush at this is to untapestry it and work on them separately, because for, I think, a practical reason, it's a big mouthful. And I know for me, and I'm just looking at this the other day, I read these through, there's some I feel strongly about positively, some I feel strongly negatively, and I think when you bundle, you draw fire for the whole package by the group that doesn't like a piece. And I think we had that problem with village center zoning. So, you know, just the thought that maybe we want to unbundle, and as we go forward, and the ones that the planning board picks to carry forward or not, that we do them as discrete pieces. But
Yeah, I think
That's fine.
they would all be separate articles in any case.
This was a thematic bundling,
Thematic.
not a so much a.
It wasn't
It
clear.
was the intent
Glad I
to
asked
try
the
and
question.
cover all of the bases we could. We did not presume that we had created perfection here.
But it wasn't a zoning package.
No.
Okay, then that was the question. Okay, thank you.
So this overview is to help us help the planning board decide which ones to pursue. And so on. Okay, do you want?
If I may, the other amendments, and then we'll maybe at the end quickly say something about village centers. I mentioned before that the Department of Environmental Protection has asked Amherst to amend actually its health regulations, and there's a separate effort underway with regard to that, to respond to the way in which activity is allowed within a certain distance of our public water supplies, and it's particularly Atkins Reservoir, because that's the only surface water supply we have where we have any shoreline in Amherst. So what we have done is to make some amendments here that simply reference the state regulations, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts regulations, the CMRs, rather than trying to get into parsing out the ways in which different kinds of uses are regulated. Part of the reason for this is that the way in which the state identifies uses that it feels might be noxious in terms of public water supply does not have any correspondence to the way in which we've organized use categories in the zoning bylaw, and we would be doing backflips for some extended period of time trying to create language that did that. It's simpler to simply say, you have to abide by, in the zoning, you have to abide by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts regulations.
I think it's mainly an effort to bring these regulations to people's attention when they're considering developing property. That's why the state wants us to include this in the zoning bylaw, because often people don't read the state regulations when they're considering developing property, and they may or may not even realize that they're within a certain number of feet of public water supply. So I think that's the main intention, is to sort of flag these things as, you better go look at the state regs with relation to your property.
Okay, that's that one. Historic preservation and demolition delay. This really, again, consists of two parts, one of which is challenging but not that difficult to do, the other of which may be both challenging and difficult. Again, the first part would be the extension, as I believe up to 6 other communities in Massachusetts, 7, excuse me, including Leverett, have now extended their demolition delay period from 12 months to 18 months, finding that it's very difficult if a public entity wants to organize itself to respond to the opportunity to preserve an historic structure. It's very hard to do that within a year. Raising funds, organizing who's going to own and manage properties if there's going to be a change in ownership. It's not a simple thing to do. So that's one piece. And we have met initially with the Historical Commission, and they are supportive of exploring this. The second piece would be to add, and we again have to go through town council on this, to add a provision that says that if a property is subject to a special permit or a site plan review, and it includes building structures, landscapes, or sites that are, one, listed on the National Register of Historic Places in an area, in a district, listed on that register, eligible for listing, and there are criteria for that, or finally have been determined by the Historical Commission to be historically significant under the criteria that are established in the bylaw, then the property owner or whoever is going to do something to this property shall, to the maximum extent feasible, preserve, rehabilitate, restore, or reconstruct those historic structures according to the standards of treatment for historic properties of the National Park Service. This is not I'm not aware that this has been done somewhere else. This adds a fairly significant burden to property owners. The question will be is whether or not that burden is important enough to the community to impose it on itself, essentially. There's some allowance for moving buildings around on a property or to another site in order to save them. And there are various procedural changes made in the language to try and accommodate that change. We included most of the entire article section where we're making some minor changes, mostly in titles of things. I draw your attention to page 5, section 13.4. That lists, and over onto page 6, that lists the criteria that the Historical Commission would apply to a property or a structure in order to determine its historical significance. So that's that one. Next is the design and development standards, and specifically what this would do is create a new section in the bylaw that would accommodate design and development standards of various kinds. The first set to go in there is proposed to be the sustainable design and development standards that were developed under the Village Center form-based zoning. And these speak to energy efficiency, alternative energy, energy conservation, low impact development, which is a specific kind of development dealing with how you deal with the site, to deal mostly with water and runoff, and utilities and services. We have given a copy of this to our Public Works Department to review, particularly our town engineer. They are increasingly, communities in their own efforts in public facilities are required to use low impact development methods, and this would extend that beyond public facilities to private development. Agricultural processing. I was saying earlier, when people were coming in and picking up paper off the table, we really should provide tote bags so that you could carry this stuff back and forth between home. This is something that you had already done. This is simply lifting out of the proposed amendments for the village centers a provision that would expand the existing light manufacturing category to include agricultural processing. And I noticed that we have not included that actual language in the title, which we need to. What that is intended to do is to expand the range of potential facilities that can support local agricultural activity. One of the limitations we're putting on this is that those agricultural processing facilities that deal with animal products, slaughterhouses, abattoirs, processing facilities for tanning, etc., would be permitted only in the light industrial district and not in village centers. Obviously, you don't want a tannery Yeah, smack dab right next to a coffee house. They don't go well together. The last amendment in your packet is the in-process language for a transfer of development rights provision. And the difference between this one and others, this is largely model language that was developed by the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission and then responded to by the staff. And one of the things that we did was to add to this not just the use of transfer of development rights for farmland and conservation lands of different kinds, but also for historic preservation, or historic properties. And we're still working on how that works out. You will find in there a couple of tables, one of which talks about exchange standards for transfer of development rights, what a certain number of building lots out in a farmland or conservation area would be equivalent to in terms of development right increase in a receiving zone. And the other is Table 5, which is dimensional standards. We have not, particularly the dimensional standards, we have not worked out the bugs on this one yet. And much of this language is simply as proposed by the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission and is not yet truthed against our own dimensional process. There's also, usually in italics, some discussion in there so you can see the staff talking to staff. Finally, there are a couple of sets of maps on the table. There's also a copy of the master plan, excerpts from the master plan about zoning regulations. The first of these, both of those sets of maps are principally offered as discussion around the Atkins Corners Village Center. The first one, which shows the 2002 concept plan for Atkins Corner, shows the change from the road layout, and I would particularly draw your attention to the road layout developed in 2002, and then the road layout developed as you turn the page in the 2009 through 2010 Mass Highway process, which instead of creating slender roadways wandering around a green, created two large roundabouts. In the process, if you look from that second page to the third page, much of the potential development that was possible under the 2002 concept plan went away. The roadway ate up a great deal of what was potentially developable. That was one of the reasons why there was a proposal by the subcommittee to extend the mixed-use Atkins Corners district across to the east side of Route 116 in that vicinity. The second set of maps shows three centers: the town center, current town center, the current North Amherst Village Center, and three versions of the proposed Atkins Corners Center. And the areas highlighted in red are those areas where you have a double-loaded street, where development of a mixed-use kind on both sides of a street helps to activate the other side, where you don't have a village center street and open space or an empty area opposite it. Part of the challenge in downtown, in Amherst, is the presence of, it's not a bad thing, but it's a challenge in terms of a business district. The presence of St. Bridget's and its rectory creates a gap tooth when you're trying to go along a row of shops or so forth, and then you have to walk a half a block to get to the next set of shops. Part of what makes village centers work is that you have this reasonably continuous, double-loaded set of streets for mixed uses. What the red areas on the town center map show the areas where you have double-loaded. The North Amherst map shows that, and then there are three, as I said, illustrations of what's possible at Atkins Corners. The first one shows Applewood and areas east of 116 as included, and shows where there's the potential for double-loaded streets. The second one, if you turn the page, shows what happens if you lose Applewood. You no longer have the potential for a double-loaded street there. And the third one shows what happens, although they aren't removed on the map, what happens if you don't have Applewood and you don't have anything east of 116. The only double-loaded area is this little L wandering around the Amherst Farm Market. You then compare that third map with the map of the town center and the map of North Amherst Village, you can see sort of the impact that that restriction has on the potential for the village center. That's just for chewing on. That's just information for your interest. I'd be happy to answer any questions, or we can proceed to public comment.
Okay. Any questions? Chris?
When you do get to public comment, I just wanted to note that there's an individual here who had requested previously to be able to make a statement, and I understand that she needs to leave very quickly, so you might consider.
Does the committee want to have any discussion, or would like to move on to public comment? Okay. Ms. Hook, could you come up and speak into the microphone and identify yourself, please? Could you come up to the microphone, please?
That's so people besides us can hear you.
I am Ruth Hook, a town meeting member from Precinct 8, and I reside at Applewood. I have talked to a number of other residents about the zoning changes proposed under Warrant Article 24 at our spring town meeting. Most residents would be in favor of village center zoning and form-based zoning for Atkins Corner. However, many residents would prefer that the sentence which allowed the PURD to be lifted on Applewood be omitted from the fall warrant. It could be added again at such time as there are active plans for expansion of Applewood, which there are not at the present time. Also, we urge the zoning subcommittee and the planning board to complete the housing survey and any other surveys now in process before making any major changes.
Okay, thank you. Other members? Mr. Fox?
Thank you. John Fox, Precinct 10. I just wanted to talk briefly about the consequences that I guess a lot of us would like you to consider of landlords who don't obey the various ordinances, housing, noise, and simply their properties are problem properties. It seems to me that we'll never have the number of enforcement officers to do the kind of enforcement that we would ideally like. And so the way in which we can enforce bylaws, nuisance bylaws and all the rest, is to have really serious consequences for landlords who violate them. And so, for example, I don't know, exactly how these would work, but if a landlord has in the last year, 2 years, 3 years, health code violations, nuisance violations, then you might say there's a presumption that they cannot come forward for a special permit or for a right to convert or any of those things, so that they are prejudiced in the event they are seeking further permits from the town. Mm-hmm. And so you in effect sacrifice your right with bad behavior, and you get the right with good behavior. So I would like you to seriously think about that. Because it seems to me that the only way that landlords are going to listen to you is not by having a whole lot of rules, but for, if they do get caught, that the consequences are unacceptable.
You want to respond?
I completely agree. And the idea of performance bonds or something like that, which we require for, subdivisions, that I wonder if that principle could be applied on a smaller scale. So if you're creating a rental that essentially you have to put aside, something into a performance bond that after a certain number of years of performing nicely, you get your bond back, or you get your money back.
And then just another final comment. As a piece of this, I think you heard in the report that Rolf gave you that a lot of these investments are separated into separate LLCs. So that's what lawyers do to create separate liability so that each entity has its own liability. But I would hope that any kind of bylaws that you're adopting would say that we have the right to look at the umbrella, so that where there is a violation of this LLC, if in fact the ownership is substantially identical to other LLCs, then whatever consequences would flow if these were directly owned, they will also flow if they are indirectly owned. So you can't get away with simply having a violation for this LLC, but you say, but we haven't had a violation over here because this is a separate legal entity. So you look at the common ownership of the umbrella, which is always done. Taxi cabs in New York, 100 taxi cabs owned by the same person, but all in a separate corporation. You need to be able to address that in order to effectively treat the landlords that violate your bylaws.
I think we better check with town council before we go too far down that road. And one of the things that I remember is there was a certain restaurant in town that had persistent problems. And I was then staff person for the Zoning Board of Appeals, and the Zoning Board was warned persistently by town council then that they could not look at the behavior of the applicant in terms of whether they were going to grant the permit or not. They could only look at what was being proposed and condition it. So to look at previous behavior of landlords on other properties when considering whether you would grant a site plan review or a special permit on a particular other property, I don't think you can do. But Mr. Fox's suggestion about putting some sort of, what should you say, fines or some enforcement in place is certainly reasonable. But I don't think you can look at previous behavior of landowners when you're considering whether to grant a permit or not.
How about Steve's suggestion about performance bonding?
I suspect that in some circumstances that would be legally permissible. You understand that what you're doing is creating a higher cost for the landlord, which is going to be passed on immediately and profligately, someone can pronounce that better than I, in considerable ways to the tenants. So it's a mix. One of the things that the Zoning Board of Appeals has actually done, and the Planning Board might want to consider under some circumstances, is to grant a permit for was essentially a trial period, to have deadlines where people have to come back and have the performance under the permit reviewed, and the permit needs to be renewed at that point, or there are a variety of ways of doing it, so that you can keep if I may use the image, you keep the leash relatively short where there are potential for problem properties.
And that would be as a condition of a permit?
It would be part of the condition of the permit, that the permit would be, the applicant would need to come back before the board in 9 months or a year or whatever it was.
Go ahead, Connie.
I think you had your hand up first.
Oh, the other thing is just a ticketing system that, I know in Boston, the zoning enforcement officers just go around and write tickets for cars parked on the lawn, things like that. But it just seems that there are a number of tools that we could, use to help this issue.
I know in stores they are considering hiring a separate contractor who has the capacity to identify owners of cars located on properties and therefore determine whether or not they are tenants or not. And they haven't done that. They have some legal questions about how to do it, but they're exploring that. The enforcement officer told me just the other day. So I agree with you that all of these things must be looked at legally to see what can be done. But I would hope that we would explore all of these alternatives to make sure that landlords who are the good landlords, are rewarded for it, but the landlords that aren't will really feel the pain. Thank you very much.
Just my comment, the systems that I've looked at, and I think a lot of college and university towns have a very robust rental registration system. We do not. It combines fines or ticketing, like you suggested, and rather than try to unravel the different LLCs and get super complicated, which I don't know if it's legal or not, if you have a violation or a series of violations, you lose your license to operate. You can't continue to rent the property. That's the hook. We have approached it in the past, and there wasn't a sort of public consensus to go that far. And I think times have changed over the last 10 or 15 years. So for me, that enforcement is you lose your right to operate the rental property. What that means for tenants and their occupancy is another thing, but whether you call it a privilege or a business obligation, you can't rent your property out if you lose your license.
That's great. Mr. Tucker.
If I may, that's not something that is done under zoning. That's something that's done under general bylaws or health codes, because zoning, because it regulates land use, provides a range of protections for property owners that other kinds of regulations do not. But yes, that's a common and well-used issue. Why we currently use ticketing. We have non-criminal disposition, and our code enforcement officer, our new code enforcement officer, has got those tickets in his pocket and ready to go. One of the things to consider is you give someone a ticket, they then have the ability, if you will, to pay it or not pay it. And if they don't pay it, you issue them another ticket, because every day that the violation continues is a separate offense. And that keeps up, and eventually you end up in housing court anyway, and it's an expensive and difficult process. You have to pursue it to make it work. In the end, you have to be willing to go to whatever mat is available to make this work. Hopefully, in most cases, the ticketing will be sufficient.
Ms. Adams.
The other Ms. Adams.
Go ahead. Identify yourself.
Thank you. My name is Tom Airgood. I'm a member of the Zoning Board of Appeals, and I want to make a comment about the question that was raised concerning the way the issue of owner occupancy might play into a special permit decision. Mr. Tucker correctly said that in no circumstance is the fact of owner occupancy itself, or the lack of owner occupancy, a basis for making a decision not to approve a permit application. But I would like to elaborate a little bit and say a way in which that the question of owner occupancy may play into a decision. There are certain circumstances, such as there would be if this amendment here to 1 and 2 family dwellings, which would establish a Class 2 single-family detached dwelling in which there would not be owner occupancy, in which the question of owner occupancy would be irrelevant. But in another circumstance where it's not ruled out, what does the Zoning Board of Appeals do? It must look at an application and determine whether the proposed use would have an adverse impact on abutters. And if it determines that the proposed use would have an adverse impact on abutters, the Zoning Board of Appeals must determine whether that adverse impact can be mitigated sufficiently. It's in that decision whether an adverse impact could be mitigated sufficiently that the issue of owner occupancy would be a relevant consideration. So I just wanted to make clear that it's not a question that owner occupancy is not a relevant consideration. It's not a determinative one in itself, but it's relevant to the question of the mitigation of adverse impact.
Thank you. Ms. Adams.
Thank you, Tom.
Morianne Adams, Precinct 10, Town Meeting Member. I had written to you, Mr. Crowner, and Mr. Carson, since I knew before you were the only 2 members of the Zoning Subcommittee, so I do have some questions that I will give out to other members rather than elaborating on them here. But I do think that from the perspective of those of us who are living intermixed with duplexes that have now become de facto rooming houses, you know, for lack of a better name, there's some things that seem to be bottom line as a norm, as tilting a norm back to genuine mixed use and family use. And that is the removal of the by right conversion from single to duplex. In other words, that the burden has to be on the conversion rather than the expectation that that is going to be by right in the RG. And my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding had been that there is a by right assumption of that right of conversion in the RG. So since that's a governing assumption, if I'm wrong on that, I do need to be corrected. Before I go on, did
Mr.
you want to
Tucker?
respond to that?
Let me say quickly, right now duplexes are regulated under site plan review approval by the planning board
Yes, I
in the general residence and in the village center residence districts. That is a by right use to the extent that if the use follows all of the provisions of the bylaw and the planning board in looking at the criteria that it must review, just as the ZBA reviews criteria, in assessing the proposal, if the planning board finds that it meets all of the criteria, even if there are some things it doesn't like, it is obliged to grant the permit. It can
Thank you.
add conditions.
Yes.
It can add conditions
Thank
as
you.
can the ZBA.
That was precisely the reason I would like to remove that by right, because I have been present, and as some of you know, active in some of those hearings where I could see where the presumption was going. And I would like the presumption to return to not to have the by right conversion, because I think that's one piece we're saying of a complicated picture, and we're trying to look at all the contributing elements to what is genuinely a crisis for us in our neighborhood.
If I may ask a clarifying question, I've noted that depending on who's speaking, the proposal is to change duplex regulation from site plan review back to special permit if there is not an owner-occupant, and the presumption is that the property is rented. Are there circumstances under which a rental and again, we're not sure that this is a direction we can go, but a rental could occur in a duplex and an owner-occupant would not be present, but the nature of the household unit, the family unit that occupies the household was such that it was not problematic? Because your experience has been pretty exclusively because of your proximity to the university,
Exactly.
that if it gets rented, it's filled with students.
Exactly.
Up to or beyond what the legal limit is.
And if I may, it has been, as far as we can judge, part of the intention of the LLCs that have purchased those buildings.
Oh, yes.
And handled them as duplexes, that they would get the income from them that is really the equivalent of a boarding house. So I do think that there, one of my questions is going to be about your lodging or boarding house definition. I would want to see that not allowed in the RG, and then we would raise, indeed, the interesting question about how to deal with grandparented situations that already exist with well more than 8 persons unrelated living there. So, I know that when I say that, we're dealing with a violation, number 1, it's more than 8. We're dealing with a parking violation, number 2, there are more than 8 cars. We're dealing with nuisance houses, number 3, on party night, when 10, 12 residents bring all their friends and taxis pull up asking where the party is. So there's a whole range of issues I think that we have to look at in the bylaw changes as well as in the permitting language. And the reason I want to reaffirm what Ralph Karlstrom has said and what John Fox has said is that we very much want the responsibility to be on the part of owners and managers who profit from these properties, and not from students who come and go. I mean, there are students whom I would be very happy to see evicted, and there are other students whom I know will shape up if there was responsible ownership and management of those buildings. And so that is why our emphasis is now coming down on the adults who are making a profit from turning these houses into, in effect, lodging houses.
Let's,
Yeah.
Mr. O'Connor, did you, Ms. Barbara? And I just want to remind you, it's 6:45, so.
So this should be fairly quick. Denise Barbarette, Precinct 9. And this is awfully ambitious. I know that you're not planning on doing everything that is listed here, but I do want to urge the board to think very, very carefully, since there are approximately 3 months, maybe a little bit less before town meeting comes up in the fall, to really consider carefully exactly how much they can accomplish of what has been laid before you, and also to seriously think about prioritizing the different articles that have been presented. As you know, of course, I was on the board from 2007 to 2010, and during that time I will use the verb distressed, to see what appeared to be an increasing trend of heaping the plate full of amendments, articles, many of which were extremely complex and many of which really needed more time to be fully vetted, not only by this board, but by other boards and the public as well. There were a number of negative consequences to that. One of the things that I'll mention right off is that articles that really needed to be prioritized, such as the replacement for the phase growth bylaw, simply did not happen. I don't remember exactly the year when that was, but the phase growth bylaw was going to become no longer in effect in the zoning bylaw. And I was really quite appalled to see that at each zoning subcommittee, maybe 10, maybe 15 minutes was sort of casually dedicated to the replacement for it. And then as it got closer and closer to town meeting of that particular year, I think people realized, oh my, we're not going to be able to get this done in time. So what was proposed was essentially a stopgap measure, which was we extended the phase growth bylaw for another year past the 5 years which we had already been given. Then a fairly similar process happened the next year when it really needed to be replaced, and that resulted in Article 14, and that failed at town meeting, as you probably remember. I think also the process of Article 14 is fairly representative of a trend I started to see during that time. They were complex articles. There was a lot of work that needed to be done on them, but at the same time, other articles seemed to crowd their way in, and I think the focus of this committee really got to be very diffused. So as a result, when it came time for these articles to continue the process of going to boards, going to public hearings, they weren't fully developed the way they should be. The language was not ready. Many of the times what happened was we had the public hearing after the articles had been submitted for the warrant, which basically meant the language was frozen, and any amendments that needed to be done would have to go through a fairly complex process, even on the floor of town meeting. Things were brought to boards with all sorts of changes as well. I remember one particular instance on the medical articles, medical offices article, where Alyssa Brewer was sitting going, I don't know what the actual article is here. And we don't need that kind of confusion. These articles are confusing enough even when they're fully formed and ready to be presented. We don't need the additional confusion of, well, maybe this, maybe that, maybe the other thing, and look, when we get to the floor of town meeting, we'll change it. And then I think the final thing that I'll mention is for an article to actually go on the warrant without having been through the process of the public hearing doesn't seem to me like a good way to do planning. The public doesn't have a chance to really give input, and then if things really need to be changed, they have to be done on a rush on the floor of town meeting, which is not sufficient time for people to really think things through, particularly in terms of what might be the unintended consequences. And it's just not fair to the public. If you're going to submit an article that is supposed to be for the benefit and general welfare of the residents of the town of Amherst, which is what our zoning bylaw purports to do, then you really should give the public a chance to really weigh in on the particular language before it's sent to the warrant and people say, well, this is what it is, and we can't really change it now. Thank you.
So it's 10-2. We'll take one more, Mr. Gillen.
Bill Gillen, I live at Sunset Avenue, been there since 1969. I was at a public hearing a few months ago at the new police station for the campus, the UMass, where the UMass was talking about its planning for the future. And they talked about greatly expanding the number of students on the campus. And they didn't have any knowledge of what the mixed percentage was of students to regular people in the neighborhoods surrounding the university. They didn't have any, what's more, they said that they're very pleased with the mix, with their number of students that they house on campus. that they think it's really good for the students, and I agree probably, that they should get out in the community and learn how to be citizens. That means that we're all on the faculty, we're all part of UMass because we're all part of the campus. And as that earlier speaker said, you know, they could be held, the university perhaps could be somewhat responsible either for the behaviors, or they could be maybe issued the moratorium to not expand until they house or agree to take care of or be responsible for their own.
Just very quickly, in the last 3 or 4 years, roughly contemporaneous with the Gateway Corridor visioning process, the university has become vastly more accessible to the town and worked with the town. They have a new dean of students who is rapidly acquiring a bad reputation among students who live on campus because she actually enforces the code of conduct off campus. So that's right. There you go. See? And that's how she knows. So, well, we should actually, I'm not sure that anyone who worked on the UMass master plan has any excuses because a number of them live in that neighborhood too. A number of the campus planning folks live nearby. So, but the point is that the university is responding slowly. If you change chancellors like Kleenex, it's hard to get consistent, you know, policies out of an institution. We have a new chancellor. The town manager is going to be meeting with him, and we hope to invite him to a planning board meeting where he can hear some of this and help to guide the direction of that.
Okay, Vince, go ahead.
Vince O'Connor, Precinct 1. Just briefly for a minute to follow up on Ms. Barbarette's suggestion. I would just urge you to not pursue articles that the rental registration, for example, putting that in the bylaw. No need to do that. We already have a rental registration thing through the Board of Health. The other thing is the lodging and boarding house. You look on the back page, and it purports to try to regulate in the zoning bylaw the internal organization of the activities there, including that people can't have overnight guests, and you can't provide meals to people who don't live there.
That's state law, by the way.
Right. Well, but unfortunately, the state law, the law is sometimes, to quote some very famous person, an ass. And in this case, in this town, the law is to let us not write in things that we know are unenforceable. It promotes disrespect for the law to make laws which we know neither can be enforced nor are going to be obeyed. And I just would urge you to walk away from those things and focus on things that people have talked about that seem to be important, like not just rental registration, but rental permitting, where you have a presumption at the beginning when you don't have a record of rental thing that you get a permit, and then when you get a record, you start getting moratoriums on being able to get any more permits, and then you start losing your permits, and then you have a lot of houses you can't rent, and that changes behavior very quickly.
Okay, if there's no further comment, we'll adjourn. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ron.